The Simon Foundation, met a few weeks ago, and we all felt it was really important to have a conversation about Israel. We weren't exactly sure where to turn, but one of our board members is Margie Goldwin, and she had a connection for us. So thanks to Margie's efforts, I am happy this morning to introduce to you Dan Goldwin, who should need no introduction to those of you who are from Temple Beth El in the South Bend area. Dan has grown up since his religious school days at Temple Beth El, and he is now the executive director for public affairs for the Jewish Federation of Chicago, which includes the Jewish Community Relations Council and Government Affairs Department. And along with Dan, I'd like to introduce Ofer Bavly. Ofer is a vice president of JUF and director general of its Israel office since 2012. Prior to that, he was a career diplomat for Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm going to turn this over to Dan, and he's going to give you a little introduction and explain how to pose your questions that you may have along the presentation. Dan mentioned earlier to me that he's had 300 updates from Ofer since October 7th. So things keep changing. And again, I thank you for attending so that we can kind of get an idea of where we are and what's happening. So over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Marzi. And thank you, Bob, as well, for inviting Ofer and me to do this update from my hometown. As I recently told you and Ofer, this is the only time I think I ever get top billing over my friend and colleague Ofer Bavly, who is actually Israel's first third-generation diplomat. So usually he is far more important on the billing than I am. When I was originally thinking about what I was going to say during this kickoff, before handing it off to Ofer, I thought about I was going to share some of my impressions from my experiences from my last trip to Israel, which was the week before Passover. Or to put it more succinctly, I actually landed in Israel less than 24 hours after Iran launched its barrage of missiles, rockets, and drones. I actually left Israel a week later, a day after Israel's limited response. However, as the Middle East is apt to do, circumstances have overtaken my original plans. So by now, we're all aware of Israel's daring and complicated rescue yesterday of hostages Noah Agramani, Shlomo Ziv, Almog Meir Jan, Andrei Kozlov, as well as the death of Chief Inspector Anan Zmora, who led the effort to save Meir Jan, Ziv, and Kozlov. As I read about their rescue yesterday and saw the videos of them reuniting with their family and friends, I was reminded of my meeting while in Israel with Rachel Goldberg, Hirsch Goldberg's mother. She told us that she wakes up every day, looks at herself in the mirror first thing in the morning and says, okay, it's time to pretend to be human again. Yesterday, we saw hundreds of Israeli soldiers risk their lives to save 4 fellow countrymen and women. At the same time, we watched Hamas use their countrymen and women as human shields, cannon fodder, and prison guards to watch over the hostages. It's Israelis in general, and the IDF in particular, that does that every day. It does every day what Rachel expects of herself, to be human and be humane. And it's Hamas and their allies who do all that they can to destroy humanity and inflict pain. Yesterday was a wonderfully exciting day for many, brutally hard for Arnan Zmora's wife and 2 children, now widow and 2 children. And it was another devastating reminder of what the Bibas, Goldberg Poland, and 114 other families are going through every day as their families remain in Gaza as hostages. It's now my great honor to turn the floor over to Ofer Bavly to offer his opportunity to share his wisdom and insights to my hometown, as he has been doing on a regular basis for Chicago since October 7th. If you have questions for Ofer or for me, please type them into the Q&A tool in the Zoom. When Ofer is done with his briefing, I will go through the Q&A log and do my best to ask all of the questions before our time runs out. We cannot call on you live, so please don't raise your hand, but use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen to type in your question. Ofer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone, for being on this call. It's a first for me talking to this federation, so thank you for the opportunity. I'll start really by talking about yesterday's rather phenomenal rescue operation, but I'll put it in the context of the fact that there are still 120 other hostages remaining inside Gaza. Of the 120 remaining hostages, at least 43 are dead. 43 are confirmed by us independently as being already dead. So the number of live hostages is at most 77, and probably the number is probably smaller than that, unfortunately. So when we celebrate the rescue of 4, you have to remember that there's 120 who are still waiting to either be rescued or be released in a hostage exchange agreement. The operation yesterday in the refugee camp of Nuseirat by the Gaza beach. And when we say refugee camp, don't imagine this is some tent city. Nuseirat is a city for all intents and purposes, buildings, condos, 3, 4, 5 stories high, built up. They call it, the Palestinians, the Gazans call it a refugee camp. Because they call every city in Gaza a refugee camp. But it is a city for all intents and purposes. So in the city of Nuseirat, they were holding at least those 4 hostages that were released yesterday, 3 men and 1 woman. Israel had received over the course of the last few weeks some concrete intelligence as to their exact whereabouts. They have to understand that finding the pinpoint location of a person inside an area the size of the Gaza Strip is really like a needle in a haystack. We're talking about 4 people inside a hostile population of 2.2 million people who are doing their very best to guard the location secret. And yet, with very, very precise intelligence information, Israel managed to find the location of those 4 people. And had to then carry out an operation fast enough before they could be moved. As we know now in retrospect, the 4 people, the 3 men who were kept together and the woman who was kept separately, were being moved around at least 4 times during the last 8 months. So even when you do have complete information about their location, you have to act very fast before they're moved again. We don't know exactly what the sources of intelligence were. We are told that there's some dedicated technological system that was devised lately, including aerial photography and electronic signals intelligence. And I would guess that there's also some human intelligence involved in concretely, possibly somebody in there who was giving us information from the from Nuseirat neighborhood, but I don't have any proof of that. Anyway, it took weeks of planning, including building a model of the houses where they were kept. These are multiple story buildings, and models, exact replicas of those buildings were created in Israel, or exact replicas existing were used for the forces to train on and see how they can get to each floor in the house in the safest manner to get the hostages out. And the hostages were kept in 2 separate houses, about 600 feet apart, and they were kept by private families, not Hamas, but Hamas actually used private families to guard them, possibly paying those families for the service of guarding those hostages. So these are hostages were kept above ground rather than in the Hamas tunnels. That is what we know so far. Concretely, we're excuse me, we're getting more and more information as the hostages tell their stories. We know that Noa Al-Gamani, the female hostage, was kept in the home of a doctor and his son, who was a reporter for Al Jazeera network. And they told her, that family told her, they said, you're lucky that you're with us because we are fairly well off and we can take care of you and feed you and provide you with a shower, but know that your other Israeli hostages are not receiving the same treatment as you are. It's very hard to talk about a hostage being kept for 8 months as being lucky in any way, but certainly relative to other hostages, her situation was probably better. The forces arrived, and we're talking about a combined force of police anti-terror unit called Yamam, which is the designated anti-terror unit nationally, special forces of the IDF and Shin Bet Secret Service in a combined operation, arrived on the scene, many of them disguised as Arabs, as locals. Think about the TV show Fauda. This was more or less like Fauda. So you had a number of Israeli soldiers and police coming in dressed as locals with a truck carrying their belongings, which very much looked like the belongings of displaced Palestinians in Gaza. And people who were asking them in the street, what are you doing here? They said, we have just come here from Rafah. The Israelis are bombing. They bombed our house. Here's all of our belongings. There's some blankets, some clothes, whatever. And we escaped Rafah with our truck. And here's our stuff. And we're renting an apartment here. And we're going up to the apartment. And the locals believed them. They speak fluent Arabic, and they look the part, and that's how they managed to get into the two buildings at the same time with these ruses. And only once they were inside the buildings, that's when they, of course, took off their disguises and attacked simultaneously in the two buildings, so that not one of them couldn't alert the other, because the attack was simultaneous. Unfortunately, the first person into the building where the three men were kept was Chief Inspector Arnon Zmora. He was from the police Yamam, the anti-terror unit of the police. Being the first in line, as soon as he drew his weapon, burst into the house, terrorists were there guarding together with a family, and they shot him. He was severely wounded. They tried to revive him in the helicopter as he was extracted. But when he arrived at the hospital, they pronounced him dead. He was the one casualty on the Israeli side. He was first in line, and he was killed. As soon as they opened fire in the two houses, terrorists from all over the neighborhood converged on the buildings, started shooting, started firing at the forces. The forces then called in reinforcements, came in from different parts of the area, because they had kept the perimeter away from the buildings so as not to alert the people guarding the hostages. And those forces arrived. There was a huge firefight with machine guns, grenades, RPGs. And then the Israeli forces eventually called in air support, and the air support from unmanned vehicles as well as jets created a sort of a ring of fire around the two buildings to stop terrorists from coming in. In that ring of fire and a lot of bombs dropping around the buildings, careful not to hit our own troops, a number of Palestinians were killed. Hamas says 274. I would never take Hamas's word for anything. If they say 274, it can be anything between 30 and 274. But definitely people who were in the streets, in the buildings around, were killed, as well as probably at least 100 terrorists who were coming in with their RPGs, their grenades, their rifles, as that ring of fire protected the area of operation. Eventually, the forces with the hostages got into a number of cars that carried Palestinian license plates and started driving out. One of the cars was disabled as the Palestinians were shooting at it, and the forces had to move to a different vehicle under fire as they were being shot at with the hostages, move them from one vehicle to another, and finally made it to the beach, where, contrary to our regular standard operating procedure, large helicopters landed right on the sand on the beach, something that we don't do in Gaza because of anti-aircraft fire from the Palestinians. It's very, very dangerous to land a helicopter there. But those helicopters landed on the beach. Two helicopters carried out the forces as well as the hostages. One helicopter they tried to shoot at missed, and the helicopters immediately left and took the hostages to Israel. Contrary to rumors and contrary to what is being spread on social media, there were no U.S. forces involved. Pro-Palestinians are saying that there were American forces on the ground, Delta Force, whatever, killing Palestinians. Absolutely false. There were no American forces on the ground. They're also saying that Israel used the humanitarian wharf that was built by the U.S. By the Gaza beach to rescue the hostages. Absolutely false. There's videos all over social media. You can see in the videos that the helicopter is clearly standing on the sand on the beach, not on the wharf. It's absolutely much safer, by the way, for the helicopter to be on firm ground rather than be on a wobbly wharf. So again, there are those who are attacking the United States for having participated in this event by providing a landing pad for the helicopters. False, fake news. The one truth to the story is that there was some intelligence gathering that was shared with Israel. So intelligence that was gathered by the United States, we don't know what type, signals intelligence, visual intelligence, whatever, was shared with Israel in order to locate the hostages. I can't tell you what kind of intelligence, and I can't tell you how decisive it was. That's as far as U.S. Participation is concerned in the event. The 4 hostages are in good condition. They have been joined by their families. One of the hostages, who was a recent immigrant from Russia, his parents arrived today from Russia to join him. And unfortunately, one of the hostages' father passed away about 20 hours before he was released, which is very, very sad indeed. His father was waiting for him to return, and he didn't know that his son would be released 20 hours after he passed away. We don't know anything yet about the mental condition of the 4. We just know that physically they're okay, and will likely be released from the hospital today or tomorrow after a long series of checkups. As to their mental situation, it's anybody's guess. I would say that after 8 months in captivity, even if you get food, even if you look okay physically, mentally, they will surely need a lot of help, a lot of support in the coming months and possibly years. We haven't yet started to hear the stories of their captivity and what went on. They may have very well suffered a lot for a few months before they were moved to their present location from which they were extracted. Moving on from there to the situation in Lebanon, we are seeing a sharp escalation in the number of attacks from Lebanon. Just to remind you and put this in context, Israel never started the war against Lebanon. Lebanon, Hezbollah, started the war against Israel on October 8th, unprovoked, as a sign of solidarity with the Palestinians of Gaza. Since then, they have been launching hundreds, actually thousands of rockets at Israel, and they're escalating it month by month. This past month of May, saw a rise of about 36% in the number of rocket attacks relative to the month of April. So there's a sharp increase, and they are now using more and more UAVs on unmanned aerial vehicles, penetrating Israel. Those UAVs carry explosives, and they try to crash on Israeli cities, Israeli military bases, Israeli homes. They're also using anti-tank rockets, which are line of sight kind of rockets. They're not ballistic. So you see your target. It can be as far as 6 miles away, and you launch a missile, which goes in a straight line straight to your target. A lot of the houses in Kiryat Shmona, in Metula, in the kibbutzim and moshavim around the Lebanese border have been targeted directly by anti-tank rockets. Hundreds of homes have been destroyed in this way. These anti-tank rockets cannot be intercepted by Iron Dome. I've been asked about this by a lot of people. Iron Dome can only intercept ballistic rockets. So rockets that go up in the air, then come down, can be intercepted by Iron Dome. With anti-tank rockets, what happens is because they have a flat trajectory and very, very rapid, Iron Dome cannot intercept them. They also fly very low. Hezbollah has also found a way to launch the UAVs in a way that they fly very, very low and fast. So they also have managed to escape the sort of network of Iron Dome. And many of those UAVs have managed to hit their target inside Israel. The situation is that we have now between 70 and 80,000 residents of the north who can't go home. They can't return to their homes. Their homes are being pummeled day after day after day. It's just not safe to be anywhere within a 6 or 7 mile range of the Lebanese border because of those anti-tank missiles and UAVs. But actually, the entire Galilee can be targeted by Hezbollah. We know that Hezbollah has long-range missiles, which are far more precise, far more sophisticated than what Hamas has, furnished, of course, by Iran. In fact, their long-range missiles can cover the entire territory of Israel. So they have a range that can go all the way to the south, all the way to Beersheba, probably even beyond. And if there is, in fact, an all-out war with Lebanon, we're going to see those long-range missiles. For the time being, it's unsafe to be within 6 or 7 miles of the border. But again, you can be targeted anywhere in Israel's north, anywhere in the Galilee, which is why 70 to 80,000 Israelis can't go home. There are two solutions to this situation, which is not sustainable. One solution is diplomatic. Reach an agreement. By the way, there has been an agreement with Hezbollah, with the United Nations, Resolution 1701 from 2006, after the Second Lebanon War. That resolution says that Hezbollah must redeploy north of the Litani River, about 25 miles north of the Israeli border. That does not put their missiles out of range. As I said, their missiles can cover the entire Israeli territory. So even if they're launched from 25 miles away, they can still cover our territory. But at least the anti-tank missiles, the short-range rockets, even the UAVs cannot reach us if they are launched from 25 miles away, or they will be detected. So Israel is demanding that Resolution 1701 be complied with. Hezbollah refuses. Lebanon, as a government, refuses to comply with 1701. But certainly a diplomatic solution would help us avoid a full-on war in Lebanon should Hezbollah actually comply with that resolution. We're not seeing that happen anytime soon. The other scenario, the other solution is, of course, military. So Israel could foreseeably enter Lebanon, attack on the ground, not just from the air, as we have been doing for the last 8 months, because in order to actually take Hezbollah away, take it out, or move it 25 miles from the border, you need ground troops on the ground along the entire border, fighting much as we did in the Second Lebanon War in 2006. In the eyes of the international law, Lebanon carries full responsibility for whatever Hezbollah does from its territory. So international law considers that if you, as a sovereign nation, in this case Lebanon, allow a terror organization to operate from within your territory, then you carry responsibility. Lebanon is responsible for any attack from its territory against Israeli territory, and Israel is likely going to put a lot of pressure on Lebanon. There are already those in Israel calling for military pressure on Lebanon. In other words, attack Lebanese infrastructure, attack Lebanese power plants, attack the port of Beirut, attack the airport of Beirut. Make Lebanon pay the price for what Hezbollah is doing in order for Lebanon to put pressure on Hezbollah to desist and to not drag the entire Lebanese country into an all-out war, which Lebanon certainly is not interested in. From our side, the IDF is ready. The IDF has said that it has all the plans in place, has the troops in place, has the equipment. It just needs the order. Once the order is given, the IDF can roll into Lebanon. Of course, that's not something Israel desires, but if need be, and if the attacks from Lebanon continue, then that very well might happen this summer. I'm not a prophet, but I would say that the month of July, month of August probably are going to be decisive one way or another, either because Hezbollah will desist or because Israel will attack much more forcefully inside Lebanon. Moving from that to the last part of my remarks today, which is the political situation. 3 weeks ago on Saturday night, Minister Benny Gantz announced an ultimatum to the Prime Minister, to Prime Minister Netanyahu, to the government. He said, unless 6 conditions are met, me and my party were going to drop out of the present coalition. Now, they had joined the coalition after October 7 because they said that they will be there to assist and to counsel and advise the government on security and military affairs, because there's a war going on. Even though they are in the opposition, they will join the war cabinet to provide their knowledge. Of course, Benny Gantz was General Chief of Staff of the IDF, as was his party member Gadi Eisenkot. So the two of them joined the war cabinet to assist as much as needed during the war. But they said right from the start, they said, once the war is over, we're out of this coalition. 3 weeks ago, Benny Gantz said, I'm giving the government 3 weeks to come up with 6 plans for 6 issues. 1, the hostages. What's the plan for getting the hostages out? 2, what's the plan for destroying Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza? 3, what's the plan for the creation of an international coalition that will govern the Gaza Strip the day after Hamas is gone? 4, what's the plan for returning Israel's evacuees to the northern border by September 1st, which is the beginning of the school year, and to the Gaza envelope? 5, what is the plan for normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia? And 6, what's the plan for drafting the Haredis into the IDF? Now, in the last 3 weeks of this ultimatum, the government actually made no progress on any of those 6 issues. In fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the day after Gantz presented his ultimatum, said, you don't put ultimatums to us. We're going to do what we have to do. And we essentially said we don't care. The 3 weeks were up last night. Saturday night was exactly 3 weeks. But yesterday, there was the rescue operation. So yesterday afternoon, Benny Gantz canceled his scheduled statement to the press that was scheduled for Motzei Shabbat for last night. And he, in effect, canceled the announcement of his resignation, which everybody expected. Prime Minister Netanyahu came out with a statement of his own yesterday and said, this is no time for politics. This is no time for bickering. This is a time for unity. And Benny Gantz should not resign the government, even though the Prime Minister knows very well that he never complied with any of those 6 demands presented by Benny Gantz. So he put Benny Gantz in a corner, essentially saying, either you quit in a time when we need you, or you stay in and you come out, somebody who's doesn't fulfill his promise or his threat. Benny Gantz immediately came out with his own statement immediately after Netanyahu and said, yes, this is a time for unity, but the challenges are still ahead of us. The 6 issues I mentioned are unresolved, and therefore I will decide what to do. Today, he announced that he will be making a statement at 8 p.m. That's in an hour and a half. And the expectation is that today at 8 p.m., Benny Gantz will in fact resign from the government. Now, what are the implications? First of all, when Benny Gantz and his party joined the coalition, it didn't really change anything politically, because the coalition had before, and still does, 64 seats out of 120 in the Knesset. So they still have a majority of 4. So government is stable. The fact that Benny Gantz and his party resign does not topple the government, as the government would topple if one of its other coalition partners were to resign the government. So Benny Gantz was an addition on top of 64. If he drops out, they're back to 64. Government is relatively stable. However, there is a snowball effect. So if Benny Gantz leaves the government, it could lead to more pressures within the government. It could lead to people within Likud maybe raising their protests against the way the government is handling the situation. And it will be a sign that the so-called real war is over. Because as I mentioned before, when Benny Gantz joined the government, he said, I'm only going to be in as long as we're fighting a war and you need my expertise. If he drops out, it actually means, well, maybe you don't need me, so maybe the war, or at least the high-intensity war, is behind us, which sends a signal to every Israeli saying, well, you know, the war in Gaza is now low intensity, not very different from past situations, and therefore it's okay to go back to politics as usual from everybody's side. So, you know, tonight will be an important and decisive moment, even though it will not signal the fall of this government immediately. Meanwhile, Benny Gantz is looking at the polls, and in the polls he's losing popularity the longer he stays within the government, because his own voters are saying you're propping up the Netanyahu government. There's no reason to give him this lifeline. While right-wing voters who supported Benny Gantz in the past are saying you're not an alternative. You're weak. You're staying. You gave an ultimatum of 3 weeks. What's that about? You're not the strong right-wing leader that maybe some people thought he was. So he's losing popularity the longer he stays. When he leaves, you're going to see more outward friction within the coalition. First of all, there's going to be more and more blame on Netanyahu, also because of his refusal to form a commission of inquiry. He keeps delaying the formation of an inquiry. He keeps saying that an inquiry will only investigate the army and the military, but not the political echelon. And there's more and more people, even within the right wing, even within Likud, who are saying a commission of inquiry needs to investigate everybody, not just the army. When Benny Gantz leaves the government, you're going to see more and more talk about that, because Benny Gantz has already presented a draft bill to the Knesset saying a commission of inquiry needs to be established immediately. The second issue of contention within the coalition, which is going to become more and more vocal, is the Haredis and the draft. Benny Gantz is going to talk more about that. The Haredi parties are putting pressure on Netanyahu to pass immediately a bill that exempts all the Haredis forever from military service. The Supreme Court still has to rule on that issue, which was debated by the Supreme Court last week. I expect the Supreme Court to come out and say that in the absence of a law, all Haredi men at 18 are eligible for the draft. We're talking 60,000 people. And the Haredis are under a lot of pressure, and they're going to put pressure on Netanyahu to pass a law against what the Supreme Court is going to declare. Third issue of contention within the coalition is that the far right, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, are opposed to a hostage deal, whereas the two Haredi parties have already indicated that a hostage deal may be necessary and the hostage lives are maybe more important than pursuing the war. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are strongly against it. They're saying that any hostage deal right now means stopping the war. They're against it, and they're threatening to quit the government if the government makes a hostage deal. That includes stopping the war. So that's going to blow up in the next couple of weeks. Finally, you're going to see more and more voices, as I said, within Likud, which are anonymous for now, which start to view Netanyahu as a liability when they look at the polls, whereas Netanyahu was always an asset to Likud and to the right. More and more people are seeing him as a liability right now. Interestingly enough, one of the people who Netanyahu perceives as a possible opposition within Likud is former Israel ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, who returned from the United Nations, is in the Likud, is a member of Knesset from Likud. But today, Netanyahu announced that he's sending him back to New York to become Israel's ambassador to the United Nations as of this summer. That's no coincidence. I think Netanyahu is appointing Danon in order to keep him away from Israel, away from the Knesset, away from creating an inside opposition to himself in Likud. So Danny Danon has been appointed ambassador to the United Nations, as the present ambassador, Gilad Erdan, has decided to come back to Israel this summer and not extend his stay by another year. Netanyahu offered him the U.S. ambassadorship in Washington. Again, probably because Netanyahu considers Gilad Erdan a possible contender for leadership of Likud, so he offered him a stint as ambassador in Washington. Gilad Erdan said, no, I'm coming back to Israel. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of politics behind everything you read and everything that's happening in Israel, but that's business as usual for us. That's what I wanted to remark today, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Ofer, thank you again for, as usual, a tour de force, taking us from the top to the bottom on Israel and then digging into the politics. All right, so we'll jump into the questions. The first question is that one of the complaints that comes from the diaspora all the time is Israel's Hasbara. They're doing a bad job getting their information out. The classic example right now is we all know that the death count that Hamas puts out is greatly exaggerated. The United Nations has already established it's greatly exaggerated. Yet everybody from President Biden to pick your media outlet constantly cites to Hamas's death counts and battle damage assessments and so forth. Do you think Israel can and should it be taking more efforts to get its story out?
It's a bit of an uphill battle, or a Sisyphus task. I did Hasbara for 24 years as a diplomat for the Israeli Foreign Service. So I know what we're up against. We're up against a lot of lies, a lot of propaganda, a lot of demonization and dehumanization of Israel by a concerted effort on the part of hundreds of millions of people. It's very, very hard to face lies with facts, for a number of reasons. One reason is that Israel has never, nor does it now, invest in its Hasbara the amount of dollars that need to be invested in our public relations, in our PR. We always used to say, when I was still working as a diplomat, we used to say that Israel's Hasbara budget is smaller than the ad campaign budget of a regular diaper company in Israel. And it's very much true. Still today, our embassies typically receive a budget of $10,000, $20,000 a year for Hasbara. You can't do anything with $20,000 a year, especially when you're faced with millions of people who are rehashing lies about Israel, including, for example, what you mentioned, Dan, the Hamas numbers. The numbers that Hamas is sending out are clearly exaggerated, clearly inflated, but it doesn't matter what you say because it's easy for the world, it's easy for anti-Israelis, it's easy for anti-Semites to latch onto those numbers. The second issue is the imagery. At the end of the day, the image of the rubble in Gaza, the image of displaced people in Gaza, the image of bodies in Gaza are very hard to dispute when the images from Israel are of a well-armed and weaponized army with tanks, with jets, with missiles, with Iron Dome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the image is one that is very hard to fight. We did have some sympathy after October 7 because the image from the kibbutzim that were destroyed on October 7 were very tough images. But public sympathy in the world was with us for about 4 or 5 days until we started hitting back. As soon as you fire back, then the image moves to the other side, and the other side looks like the victim, fighting all of those images with your hands tied behind your back, with the small numbers that we have, with embassies typically having 2 or 3 or 4 diplomats and not more, with no budget, and with world media, which is very much interested in dumbing down the situation, very superficial, trying to always paint the issue with good guys, bad guys. Israel, for better or worse, is stronger, better defended. We're losing less civilians than the other side. So when you want to dumb it down, it's so easy to present Israel as the aggressor, the other side as the victim. Our Hasbara, unfortunately, has no way of dealing with that. And I think that, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but unless we are really pummeled, we're not going to look good.
So for full disclosure, that question came in from my father. So hopefully he'll stop asking me that question now that you've answered it.
Mr. Goldwin, your son is not to blame.
And for that, I appreciate. We should end the call right here. So the next 2 questions coming in from Alana and Mike Kirsch, and then from Rabbi Campagnas, are sort of related. So news came out recently, within the past few hours, that Noah Agramani's, and that Yuda stressed it as well, one of the people responsible for her captivity is an Al Jazeera reporter. And similarly, the family holding her and holding the other hostages, these were not Hamas operatives. These were regular civilians. So the two-part question is, can we talk about what is the status of Al Jazeera and the Al Jazeera law in Israel? And then the more blunt question is, are there actually innocent civilians in Gaza, and how should we be thinking about them, especially in the context, and I know I've talked to you about this before, there were massive celebrations throughout Gaza on October 7th and 8th. And so how do we look at civilians in Gaza at this point?
Yeah, so the Al Jazeera, the so-called Al Jazeera law in Israel was passed to shut down Al Jazeera's operation in Israel because Al Jazeera is considered to be sort of like a foreign agent, which is actually really undermining Israel's security by reporting from within Israel and criticizing Israel in a way that is really detrimental to our safety, our security. There is a petition to the Supreme Court, to the courts, against the Al Jazeera law. The courts now have given the government a certain amount of time to come and explain why the law is legal, because the petition to the court says that this is contrary to freedom of the press, and freedom of the press should be guaranteed, even if that press belongs to the enemy in times of war. The government will argue that in times of war, you have to limit the foreign media and its ability to harm you. This is not a local Israeli media. This is a foreign media from Qatar. And the government will argue in court that this is endangering Israeli people. We'll see what the court says. Clearly, yes, Al Jazeera is playing a dangerous role. And as we know, an Al Jazeera staff member was one of those who were holding Noah Gaman as a hostage. So clearly, Al Jazeera is not just a regular news outlet. They also play a decisive role supporting Hamas and holding hostages. Regarding the question of innocent civilians, that's a very, very good question. For Israelis today, even the Israelis on the left, it's very hard to describe Palestinians in Gaza as innocent civilians. We saw, as you mentioned, Dan, the rejoicing in the street on October 7th. Tens of thousands of people in Gaza were partying in the street as Hamas and Islamic Jihad were bringing in hostages from Israel, some of them dead, some of them alive and badly wounded, and thousands were trying to lynch them, actually lynched some of them in the streets of Gaza, way, way, way beyond Hamas. We also know that at least half the 3,000 people who went into Israel on October 7, at least half were not Hamas. They were civilians, so-called innocent civilians, unaffiliated with Hamas. But here's a chance to kill some Jews. Let's go. Let's burn houses. Let's rape. Let's kidnap Israelis. So for Israelis, it's very hard to see the humanity of people in Gaza when you see the amount of support that Hamas receives. And we know from polls that the Palestinians themselves conduct that the support for Hamas, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, is overwhelming. The vast majority of Palestinians support Hamas, support the atrocities of October 7, whether they live in the West Bank or they live in Gaza. So are they all innocent? You know, I'm at the end of the day, I'm a humanist, and I don't think that every child in Gaza is responsible for everything that's happening. But adults in Gaza who, A, have rejoiced at the deaths of Jews, by the way, partied on 9/11 as well, 2001. Scenes of huge jubilation in the streets of Gaza on 9/11, huge jubilation on October 7, and they are hiding and protecting 120 Israeli hostages who could have been turned over by neighbors, by regular innocent civilians in Gaza, and that's not happened. So while I do not think that all Gazans are terrorists and all Gazans should be killed, that's the position of some of the radical right in Israel. I don't believe so. I do believe that the vast majority of Gazans support Hamas. That does not mean they all deserve to die. It means we need to find a solution for the conflict, and not just to manage the conflict, but actually to resolve it long-term with a permanent solution that will make these people stop supporting a terrorist organization, which has dragged them into a war which has cost tens of thousands of deaths.
I'm struck by the fact that we all know stories coming out of World War II of righteous Gentiles who did great work to save Jews, and we're not hearing those stories yet anyway, coming out of Gaza.
Not one.
Not one. So just over a week ago, President Biden, it should be noted after Shabbat had started, made his speech sort of disclosing and revealing this Israeli plan that had been kept under pretty tight lid in Israel. What's the status and current thinking on the plan in Israel? And what are you hearing from what you read in Israel about what's actually true as Hamas evaluates the plan?
So, Prime Minister Netanyahu was very, very careful not to reveal the Israeli position to the Israeli public because of political considerations. Because clearly, if he agrees to a plan proposed to Hamas that includes stopping the war, he loses half of his government. If he does not agree to stopping the war, then there's no deal. So clearly, Netanyahu had a reason and an interest to hide the details of the proposal from the Israeli public, which he did. Then President Biden on Friday night, a week ago, outed Netanyahu by presenting the Israeli position. And the Israeli position, according to President Biden, included in the second stage of a three-stage plan, including a permanent ceasefire. Immediately, the Israeli government said, no, that's not our plan. This is a misreading of our position, to which the National Security Council spokesman in the US on Sunday responded, no, we have it right. We know exactly the details of the plan. We made no mistakes. That's the plan. Now, all of that is kind of moot because Hamas actually has rejected the plan anyway. So as long as Hamas rejects the plan, there's no point in discussing the actual details. But the details did include, apparently, the release of hostages in 2 stages and a discussion of a permanent end to the Israeli attacks in Gaza and redeployment of IDF outside of the Gaza Strip. Now, for Israel, redeploying as long as Hamas is still in existence endangers our future. For Hamas, stopping the war without a redeployment of the IDF is a non-starter. So the gap between us is too big to bridge. Hamas will not end the war unless they are left standing. Israel will not allow Hamas to be left standing when we end the war. That's something that's unbridgeable. So I think that right now there's absolutely no ground for any discussion as long as those two positions are so diametrically opposed.
So let's further connect the dots. What happened on October 7th was Hamas and Israel. Hezbollah began to engage out of support for. And their initial statements were that when the war is over in Gaza, we'll stop our bit. Has that changed? Is the Hezbollah operations in the north now completely independent of what's happening in Gaza, so that if a ceasefire, if an agreement were to be struck, do we expect Hezbollah to stand down, or is this now moved on to a life of its own?
So it kind of has a life of its own, but if there is an agreement with Hamas, and again, I don't see that agreement anytime soon on the radar, but if there is an agreement with Hamas and there's an end to the war in Gaza, then ostensibly Hezbollah will lay down its weapons. The question is, what does Israel do if that happens? And does Israel wait for that to happen or attacks Hezbollah before it happens? So here's the two possibilities. Let's say that Hamas and Israel reach an agreement and there's a ceasefire, and then Hezbollah lays down its weapons. Israel will know that at any point, any time in the future, Hezbollah can again attack us and put 70 or 80,000 Israelis out of their homes as they did now. Is that something we can live with? It's a big question. Let's say we don't wait for an agreement. Let's say that Israel decides that the war has taken on a life of its own, and we need to make sure Hezbollah is moved away. And we don't wait for an agreement with Hamas because an agreement does not happen. Then Israel needs to take the initiative and do something to get rid of Hezbollah, at least in the first 25 miles north of the border in order to allow our own people to go back home. And for many Israelis, that is the responsibility of the government. You have to allow your people to go home. We can't allow a so-called security belt to exist inside Israeli territory so that 20 or 25 miles from the border, we can't go. If anybody should be away from the border, it's the other side. And that's what Israelis are calling for. And there's a growing voice in Israel calling on the government to attack Hezbollah, not wait for Hamas to decide for us that there's a ceasefire in Lebanon.
So similar to that, needing a buffer zone, there's been talk as we look back at Gaza is that Israel would require a 1 kilometer sort of strip within the Gaza border. The U.S. has come out relatively early on after October 7th and said they didn't support the restriction of any geography within the Gaza Strip. Are we looking again, Israel's going to have to rely upon technology, which did not work so well come October 7th, to secure whatever border ends up being left between Israel and Gaza?
So as you correctly say, technology did not serve us well. The thinking that we can rely on technology instead of manpower turned out to be a huge mistake. Israel will, in the foreseeable future, not rely on technology alone, but will beef up its presence in all the communities on the Gaza envelope. And we're already establishing army units that will populate those kibbutzim and moshavim along the border so as not to rely solely on technology. Having said that, there will probably be a need for a 1 kilometer buffer zone on the Gaza side of the fence, just so that the soldiers that are on the Israeli side can at least observe what's happening a kilometer or half a mile, slightly more than half a mile from the fence, whereas in the past, Palestinians could get all the way to the fence with hardly being seen. So I think there will need to be a sort of a security buffer zone of about 1 kilometer from the fence, allowing Israel to protect itself in the future. That buffer zone cannot be on Israeli soil. It will have to be on Gaza soil, because there's no reason why we should give up our fields, our agriculture, some of our kibbutzim, which are closer than 1 kilometer away from the fence. There's no reason why they should be moved just in order to protect themselves.
As you see the rhetoric that comes out of places like the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the UN, throwing around words like genocide and ethnic cleansing, how is average Israelis think in those terms when they hear that kind of rhetoric? And what's it look like from an official standpoint when dealing with those accusations in the ICC and the ICJ?
Look, we understand that this is the kind of anti-Semitic and delegitimizing rhetoric that is used against Israel, and those are buzzwords that resonate with a lot of people, especially young people on campuses and in the streets of the United States and Europe. You say genocide, and people don't need you to paint a picture. They understand what genocide is. You say ethnic cleansing, immediately you evoke a certain image in people's minds, which is very easy to latch onto when they don't want to go dive into the complexity of the conflict. So you use those buzzwords, and they work. They work, and people are chanting genocide, genocide, and the genocide, or from the river to the sea. They don't understand which river, which sea, but it's easy to chant. It's easy to latch onto. It's very disturbing when those terms are used by the United Nations or by the ICC or ICJ. Israel is doing its best to prove that there is no genocide. In fact, even if you use the Hamas numbers for the number of people killed in Gaza since October 7, you'll get to probably about 1% of the population in the best case scenario. 1% of the population killed in 8 months by a superpower such as Israel is hardly a genocide. If you discount the number of terrorists from those numbers and the number of natural deaths which occur in any given year in a place like Gaza, then certainly those numbers do not count as genocide by any stretch of the imagination, nor ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing means nothing when you're talking about the numbers of people who have been tragically killed in this war. But we have to remember and remind the world This is not a war that Israel started in order to cleanse the region from Palestinians or in order to commit a genocide. Israel was attacked on October 7th when there was a ceasefire in effect. Ceasefire was there on October 6th. It was broken on October 7th by Hamas, by Islamic Jihad, and by Palestinian civilians from the Gaza Strip. And Israel has promised both the International Court of Justice and the United States administration to do its utmost to make sure that as few civilians as possible are killed in this war. But at the end of the day, it is a war. And in war, civilians get killed. And something which is very hard for us to convince the world of, Hamas is using its very own civilians as human shields because Hamas knows that this is a win-win situation. If they use civilians to surround Hamas terrorists in schools, in hospitals, in mosques, and we don't fire because of the civilians, Hamas are safe. If we do fire and kill civilians, Hamas wins a PR war. So Hamas knows exactly what they're doing when they're using their own civilians as human shields. And unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to fully 100% protect every single civilian. However, I will say this, if Israel wanted to commit a genocide, it would have carpet bombed the entire Gaza Strip and killed 2 million people. That's a genocide. Israel didn't do that. When Israel sends in ground troops into the streets of Gaza, it runs the risk of getting those troops killed. In fact, close to 700 soldiers have been killed in the war because we're fighting house to house, door to door, in order to minimize the damage to civilians. If you just bomb the entire neighborhood, you lose 0 soldiers, but you kill a lot of civilians. Israel is not in the business of doing that. So you know, we can explain why this is not a genocide, but again, we're losing the PR war because that word genocide, that term ethnic cleansing, is so easy for people to latch onto without understanding and without bothering to know the facts.
So for the last question, try to sort of, I hope, change the tone, make it a little optimistic. So yesterday, my daughter was on the beach in Tel Aviv. She was there and they made the announcement that the hostages had been rescued. Obviously, a lot of excitement and jubilation. Can you talk a bit generically, put aside just yesterday, what's the mood like in Israel? How are Israelis doing?
Israelis are a little bit in a, I would say, roller coaster type situation. You know, on the one hand, we hear the stories of the hostages. We hear the stories of those who are killed on a daily basis. The TV studios bring up families of hostages, bring up families of fallen soldiers every single day, telling their story. We all know all the names of all the hostages, and we follow all their stories, which is putting the country in a very somber mood. And then you have these sudden peaks of happiness, like yesterday with 4 rescued hostages, and there's jubilation. And people are walking out in the street with the Israeli flag, and this lifeguards on the beach announce it on the PA system, and people on the beach rejoice. And the Philharmonic Orchestra yesterday, during a concert, they stopped in mid-concert to play Hatikva, and they announced that 4 hostages had been released. So we go from this gloom to this happiness back to gloom, and it's very, very difficult. It's very hard for Israelis to go through this roller coaster of emotions, knowing that at the end of the day, whatever happens, there will be more blood and there will be more pain and there will be more suffering on both sides, by the way, not just our side. And it's a very harsh realization for Israelis who, by and large, have been used in the past to very short wars. 6-day war, the 1 month of the Yom Kippur War. You know, even the Second Lebanon War took a month. We're now 8 months in a war, which is costing us in civilians, in soldiers, and hostages. And the mood of the country is not a mood of despair, but a mood of sadness with short bursts of happiness in between.
Well, Ofer, thank you again for lending us your wisdom. You and I will do this again tomorrow for Chicago. Before I turn it over to Bob, I just want to thank everybody for joining in. I recall as a young man being in South Bend, a young boy, Bernie Natkow being the first Federation exec I ever knew. And I have very fond memories of that. And so I will just say very clearly is that right now, there is no organization more important in the Jewish community and communities large and small than federations. So thank you all for supporting St. Joseph Valley Federation and everything that you all do. It really makes a difference. So Bob, over to you.
Thank you, everyone who joined us this morning. Ofer, thank you for that excellent in-depth briefing. And Dan, thank you for coordinating this important event. You open our eyes to and answer a lot of questions that our viewers had. Special thanks to our co-sponsors, Temple Bethel Simon Foundation, Dan, the Jewish Federation of Chicago, and special thanks to Steve Lotter, Director of Community Engagement, for all of your work on advertising and technical support behind the scenes. I encourage you, all of our viewers, to follow the emails from the federations so that you can receive updates about our events and the bi-weekly project called The Missing Context that provides expert in-depth analysis on this war. So thank you again, Ofer and Dan, and thank you everybody who joined us this morning.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.